The leather notebook lay open on the mahogany table, offensive in its vulnerability. I shouldn't have looked, yet my eyes snagged on the elegant loop of her handwriting. It wasn't a financial projection. It was a sentence, precise and devastating. She taps her ring against the glass when she's cornered, a frantic rhythm she thinks is silent. The air in the room vanished. Layla froze in the doorway, her hand gripping the brass handle. The silence that stretched between us wasn't professional. It was the suffocating quiet of a secret stripped bare. I touched the page. Is this really what you've been planning all along? In the world of high-stakes restructuring, detachment is the currency we hoard. I built my reputation on absolute precision. When a conglomerate crumbled, I was the one they called to sift through the wreckage. I treated businesses like complex equations. Solve for X, maximize efficiency, remove the human error. It was a cold existence, but it was safe. It kept the chaos of the world organized into neat columns of profit and loss. Then there was Layla. In every industry, there is a counterweight, a force that opposes you with equal and opposite violence. For 10 years, Layla was mine. They called her the Iron Closer because she didn't just win negotiations. She sealed them with a finality that left no room for appeal. She was efficient, ruthless, and terrifyingly composed. We had circled each other in boardrooms from London to Singapore, never quite touching, always separated by the width of a conference table and the armor of our tailored suits. I hated her, or I thought I did. It was the kind of hatred that felt suspiciously like admiration, sharp and bright. We had chosen the Blackwood estate for this final acquisition, not for its beauty, but for its neutrality. It sat on the jagged edge of the Pacific coast, a modern fortress of steel and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered no privacy and no escape. The deal was massive, a merger that would reshape the market. It required absolute secrecy. Just us, our legal teams, and the silence of the ocean crashing against the rocks below. We were supposed to be the architects of a billion-dollar future, professionally indifferent to the storm brewing on the horizon. But the storm didn't care about our schedules. By noon, the sky had turned a bruised purple, and the rain began to lash against the glass walls with the force of a physical assault. The roads were flooding. The legal teams, sensible and cowardly, had packed their briefcases and fled back to the city before the bridge washed out. We'll conference in, they promised, their taillights fading into the gray wash of the rain. I stood by the window, watching the last car disappear. The house felt suddenly enormous. The staff had retreated to their quarters in the annex, leaving the main residence empty. It was just me and Layla, trapped in a glass cage suspended above a raging sea. I turned back to the room. Layla was already organizing her files at the head of the table, her movements sharp and deliberate. She didn't look up, but I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her spine held a rigid, perfect line. For years, we had communicated through intermediaries and legal briefs. We had traded barbs polished until they gleamed like compliments. I admire your optimism, she would say, meaning you are reckless. Your attention to detail is exhaustive, I would counter, meaning you are boring. Now, there were no intermediaries. The silence of the house amplified everything. The click of her pen, the sound of my own breathing. The professional friction that had defined our relationship for a decade felt different here. Stripped of the boardroom safety, it felt raw. I walked to the table and sat opposite her, the mahogany expanse feeling like a battlefield we were both too tired to cross. The storm outside had erased the coastline, turning the floor-to-ceiling windows into mirrors that reflected only us and the rows of leather-bound books lining the walls. We had requisitioned the library as our command center, a room that smelled of old paper and the ozone of the storm. It was a space designed for quiet contemplation, but we had turned it into a war room. The mahogany table between us was strewn with term sheets, valuation reports, and the debris of a negotiation that had already stretched hours past its scheduled conclusion. The power flickered once, a brief pulse of darkness that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, before the generator kicked in with a low, steady hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Layla sat across from me, the geography of the table the only thing keeping us civilized. She had removed her blazer hours ago, draping it over the back of her chair with a care that bordered on ritualistic. Without the armor of the suit jacket, she looked dangerous, in a different way. Her silk blouse was a severe slate gray, rolled to the elbows to reveal forearms that were tense with focus. She didn't negotiate. She dismantled. Every clause I put forward, she stripped down to its studs, looking for structural weaknesses. The valuation on the logistics arm is inflated, she said, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the room. She didn't look at the paper. She looked at me. You're pricing in potential that doesn't exist yet. I'm pricing in the infrastructure your client is desperate for, I countered, leaning back, feigning a relaxation I didn't feel. You want the network? You pay for the years it took to build it. We pay for value, she corrected, her eyes narrowing slightly. Not sentiment. This was the dance. It was a friction I had become addicted to over the years, a cerebral sparring match where the stakes were measured in millions, but the victory was measured in pride. Layla was the iron closer because she never let emotion bleed into the ledger. She was a machine of efficiency. But sitting here in the isolation of the storm, I began to notice the cracks in the machine. Or perhaps I was just finally close enough to see the human beneath the iron. I watched her hand as she annotated a document. Her fingers were long, elegant, griping a heavy fountain pen with a force that turned her knuckles white. She had a habit I had never noticed from the distance of a boardroom. When she was thinking, really thinking, she would click the cap of the pen against the table. Click, click, click. A rhythmic, unconscious signal of a mind racing. The scent of her drifted across the table, invading my personal space. It wasn't the sterile, powdery scent of a corporate office. It was something richer. Sandalwood, maybe. And rain. And the sharp, tangible smell of ink. It was distracting. I found myself tracking the movement of her throat as she swallowed, the way a loose strand of dark hair fell across her forehead, which she impatiently tucked behind her ear. The hatred I had nurtured for a decade felt dangerously thin in this light. It felt less like animosity and more like obsession. I knew her negotiation tactics better than I knew my own family's birthdays. I knew the exact tilt of her head when she was bluffing. I knew the precise tone of voice she used when she was about to walk away. Let me see the addendum, I said, my voice sounding lower than I intended. I reached across the table at the same moment she pushed the document toward me. Our timing, usually so out of sync, was perfectly, disastrously aligned. My hand landed not on the paper, but on hers. The contact was instantaneous and shocking. It wasn't just skin against skin. It was a static discharge that snapped audibly in the quiet room. Her skin was cool, startlingly soft against my palm. For a second, just one singular, suspended second, neither of us moved. I could feel the fine bones of her hand beneath mine, the pulse beating a frantic rhythm at her wrist. The air charged between us, heavy and thick, transforming the library from a place of business into something volatile. Layla snatched her hand back as if burned. Her eyes, usually so guarded, went wide with something that looked like panic. The silence that followed wasn't the calculated silence of a negotiation tactic. It was the stunned silence of a boundary being breached. We stared at each other, the rejected document lying between us like a treaty neither of us knew how to sign. The energy in the room shifted, turning predatory and unrecognizable. We weren't colleagues anymore. We were two forces of nature, trapped in a glass box, finally realizing that the storm wasn't just outside. By 2 a.m., the generator's low, rhythmic thrum had become the heartbeat of the house, a steady counterpoint to the chaotic gale battering the coast. The library felt suspended in time, a capsule of warm light and mahogany drifting in a dark, wet void. The adrenaline that had fueled our earlier sparring had evaporated, leaving behind a gritty, heavy exhaustion. The words on the valuation sheets were beginning to blur into meaningless gray lines. I was reading the same paragraph about asset depreciation for the fourth time when the overhead chandelier flickered. The light died, plunged us into total darkness for 3 heartbeats, and then surged back to life with a reluctant buzz. The interruption broke the trance. Layla pushed her chair back, the sound of wood scraping against the rug echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. She didn't look at me. She stood up, her movements slower now, stripped of that terrifying predatory efficiency she wielded in the daylight. She walked to the sidebar where a crystal decanter of amber liquid sat on a silver tray. She poured 2 generous glasses, the glug of the liquor loud and illicit. She returned to the table but didn't sit. Instead, she leaned against the heavy edge of the desk, crossing her ankles, holding one glass out to me. It wasn't a request. "I don't drink while the contract is open," I said automatically, though my hand was already reaching for it. The prohibition felt flimsy here, miles from the city, trapped in a storm with the one person who understood the language of this war. "The contract is comatose," she corrected, her voice rougher than usual, losing its polished sheen. "And if I have to debate the liquidity of the subsidiary one more time tonight, I am going to shatter a window." I took the glass. Our fingers didn't touch this time. I was careful, so careful. But the proximity of her hand sent a phantom warmth shooting up my arm. I took a sip. The whiskey was expensive and smooth, burning a path down my throat that settled into a warm weight in my stomach. Layla watched me drink, her own glass resting against her lip. She had unbuttoned the cuffs of her silk blouse, rolling the sleeves up to her elbows. It was a small gesture, but on her, it looked like a surrender. "They call you the iron closer," I said, the alcohol loosening the lock on my tongue. "I always assumed it was because you didn't have a nervous system." A dry, humorless laugh escaped her. She swirled the liquid in her glass, watching the vortex. "It's a good brand. Iron doesn't break. Iron doesn't bleed. Iron doesn't go home to an empty penthouse and wonder if the acquisition was worth the silence." She looked up, and the raw honesty in her eyes pinned me to my chair. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Being the villain in everyone else's story just to get the job done." I stared at her. The iron closer was gone. In her place was a woman with faint lines of fatigue bracketing her mouth and a heaviness in her shoulders that no tailored suit could hide. For 10 years, I had hated the symbol of her. I had hated the perfection. But sitting here, in the dim intimacy of the library, I realized I was looking at a mirror. The precision, the coldness, the armor, it was all just a way to survive in a tank full of sharks. We were the same. We were both alone at the top of mountains we had built out of other people's failures. "I don't think you're a villain," I admitted, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I think you're just lonely." The word hung in the air, dangerous and true. Layla didn't flinch. She held my gaze, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from fatigue to something magnetic. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't catalog. It wasn't professional assessment. It was hunger. It was a confused, terrifying recognition. Her eyes dropped to my lips, then snapped back to my eyes, dark with a sudden, intense heat. The distance between us, though physical, had vanished. "And you?" she asked softly. "Are you lonely, or are you just precise?" The question felt like a hand around my throat. The pull toward her was sudden and overwhelming, a gravity I hadn't accounted for. If I stayed, if I answered, the war would end, and something much more complicated would begin. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. "I need to sleep," I said abruptly, standing up so fast my chair tipped backward. I caught it before it fell, the noise jarring. "We'll finish this in the morning." I turned and walked out of the library without looking back, but I could feel her eyes on me, heavy and burning, following me all the way into the shadows of the hall. The morning sun was cruel. It sliced through the glass walls of the estate, illuminating every dust mote and exposing the wreckage of our composure. The fog from the ocean hadn't lifted. It pressed against the windows, a wall of white that trapped us inside the fishbowl. We had retreated to our separate corners of the house to sleep, or to stare at the ceiling, but the library still smelled of whiskey and the ghost of a conversation that shouldn't have happened. When I walked in, Layla was already there. She had rebuilt her armor. The blazer was back on, buttoned tight. Her hair was pinned into a severe chignon that looked painful. She was the iron closer again, but I knew better now. I had seen the rust beneath the plating. We didn't say good morning. We just resumed the war. But the geography had changed. The table, once a vast continent separating us, now felt like a mere inconvenience. We didn't sit, we paced. The arguments over the valuation of the Asian holdings started clinically, but quickly devolved into something visceral. "You're stripping the assets to sell for parts," I accused, slamming a folder down. "It's short-sighted. It's lazy." "It's efficient," Layla snapped, stepping around the corner of the table. She was in my space now. "I'm cutting the dead weight so the entity can survive. You, of all people, should understand survival. She was too close. I could see the faint violet shadows under her eyes, the only evidence that she hadn't slept either. I could see the fine grain of her skin and the slight tremor in her hand as she pointed at the ledger. I could smell that maddening scent of sandalwood and rain. The argument wasn't about assets anymore. It was about control. I wanted to break her. I wanted to shatter that perfect, icy facade and find the woman who had admitted she was lonely in the dark. I realized, with a jolt of horror, that I was provoking her on purpose. I was throwing matches at a gas leak just to see the explosion. Is that what you tell yourself? I lowered my voice, stepping into her personal radius. That you're saving it? Or are you just afraid of the mess that comes with actually building something? Her breath hitched. I watched the flush rise from the collar of her silk blouse, staining her neck a jagged, beautiful red. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, the fabric straining against the sudden violence of her breathing. She didn't back down. She leaned in, her eyes dilated and dark. I am not afraid of the mess, she hissed, her voice low and vibrating with restraint. I am the one who cleans it up. While you sit in your tower theorizing about potential, I am down here making the hard choices. This deal is the only thing making sense right now. It is the only thing keeping me focused. The vulnerability was a weapon. She wielded it like a knife, cutting through my antagonism. She wasn't just talking about the merger. She was talking about the chaos of her life, the loneliness we had toasted to in the dark. Then focus, I challenged, my voice barely a whisper. Tell me what you want. What is the acquisition target really worth to you? The air between us thickened, heavy with double meanings. We were talking about a corporation, but we were looking at each other's mouths. The distance between us was measured in inches and heartbeats. The value isn't on the balance sheet, Layla said, her gaze dropping to my lips before snapping back up. The value is in the conquest. It's in taking something chaotic and making it mine. And if the asset refuses to be acquired, then I negotiate harder. The tension was unbearable. It was a physical weight pressing against my lungs. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to close the final inch between us and see if she tasted like whiskey and iron. Suddenly, a shrill ringtone shattered the moment. Layla flinched as if struck. She pulled her phone from her pocket, glancing at the screen. The mask slammed back into place instantly. It's the board, she said, her voice clipped and cold. I have to take this outside. The reception is better on the terrace. She turned and walked out, the click of her heels echoing like gunfire against the hardwood. She didn't look back. In her haste, she left her leather-bound notebook lying open on the mahogany table. The pages fluttered slightly in the draft from the closing door, waiting for me to make the mistake that would change everything. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I was alone with the ghost of our argument and the leather notebook she had abandoned on the table. It sat there like a trap, its cover worn smooth by the oil of her hands. In our world, information is not just power. It is the only currency that matters. If that book contained her strategy, her bottom line, or her board's secret directives, reading it would give me the kill shot. I could end the merger on my terms. I could win. My hand hovered over the leather, trembling slightly. My professional ethics screamed at me to walk away, to pour another coffee, to stare out at the relentless fog. But the curiosity was a physical itch, a burning necessity that overrode a decade of discipline. I needed to know what lay behind the iron mask. I touched the page, the paper cool and heavy beneath my fingertips. I expected columns of figures. I expected a list of my weaknesses, a SWOT analysis of my firm, or perhaps a detailed plan to gut my department post-acquisition. I turned the page, bracing myself for the cold, calculated evidence of her ruthlessness. I wanted to find the proof that she was the monster I had invented for 10 years. It would make hating her easier. It would make the attraction I felt, the terrifying magnetic pull, easier to strangle before it consumed me. Instead, I found my own name. It wasn't in a legal brief. It was written in elegant, looping ink that looked nothing like her sharp, angular signature. October 14th, London Summit. She wears the navy suit when she intends to intimidate. The light from the atrium hits her hair at 2 p.m., turning it gold. I lost my train of thought for 3 seconds. I had to ask her to repeat the clause. I froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I flipped the page, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. November 3rd. She holds her coffee cup with both hands when she is uncertain about a negotiation point. It makes her look deceptively soft. I want to hold her hands to stop them from shaking. I want to know if her skin is as warm as it looks. It went on. Pages of it. Dates, times, locations. January 12th. I provoked the audit, just to see her work under pressure. The way her eyes darken when she's angry is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I am a fool for doing this, but I needed to see her fire. March 5th. She laughed at a joke the junior analyst made. I felt a jealousy so sharp it tasted like copper in my mouth. Why does she never smile at me like that? There were sketches in the margins, rough, hurried drawings of my profile, the curve of my neck, the way I stood at a podium. It wasn't the dossier of an enemy. It was a love letter, written in the code of a stalker. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't sabotage. This was a chronicle of obsession. For 10 years, while I thought she was plotting my destruction, she had been memorizing me. Every barb she had thrown, every aggressive maneuver in the boardroom, every deal she had snatched from under my nose, it wasn't business. It was a desperate, twisted way to keep my attention. It was the only way she knew how to touch me, without breaking the rules. I felt a wave of violation crash over me. She had been watching me, dissecting me, cataloging my habits without my consent. But beneath the violation was something else, something terrifying and intoxicating. Validation. I had spent my career feeling invisible behind my own armor, assuming no one saw the woman beneath the strategist. But Layla saw. She saw everything. She saw the uncertainty in my hands. She saw the fire in my anger. She saw me with a clarity that was blinding. The hatred I had clung to dissolved, replaced by a vertigo that made the room spin. I wasn't just her rival. I was her muse. I was the center of her gravity, just as she had unknowingly become mine. The sound of heels clicking on the hardwood floor outside the library door snapped me back to the present. The rhythm was fast, agitated. She was coming back. I should have closed the book. I should have stepped away, pretended I was looking at the rain, pretended I hadn't just peered into the raw, bleeding heart of her obsession. I should have protected her dignity and my own safety. But I didn't. I couldn't. I left the book open to the page where she described the color of my eyes in the Zurich boardroom. I stood there, my hand resting on the mahogany table, waiting. I wanted her to know that I knew. I wanted to see what the iron closer would do when her armor was finally, irrevocably stripped away. The door handle turned. The door opened and Layla stepped inside, her thumb hovering over her phone screen as she finished typing a message. She didn't look up immediately. She took 2 steps into the room, her heels sharp against the floorboards, before the silence registered. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of 2 colleagues working. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a trap springing shut. She stopped. Her head lifted, her gaze sweeping the room until it landed on the mahogany table. She saw the notebook. She saw the open page. She saw me standing there, my hand still resting near the spine of the book, caught in the act of unearthing her soul. Layla didn't gasp. She didn't scramble to close it or stammer an excuse. She simply froze. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and startlingly exposed, but her posture remained rigid. She looked at the book, then at me, her eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, the iron closer flickered, threatening to return, to armor herself against the humiliation. But then her shoulders dropped, just an inch, and the air left her lungs in a long, shaky exhale. She didn't retreat. She reached behind her and clicked the door shut, locking us in. "Is this really what you've been planning all along?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and something far more volatile. The hostile takeovers, the blocked mergers, was it all just strategy? Layla walked toward the table. She moved slowly, like someone approaching a wild animal. She didn't look at the book anymore. She looked only at me. "It wasn't a plan," she said, her voice low, stripped of its usual polished cadence. It was a necessity. A necessity? I laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. You cost my firm millions in legal fees in 2019. You humiliated me in front of the Tokyo board. You call that necessity? I call it access, she countered, stopping at the opposite end of the table. Her hands gripped the edge of the wood, her knuckles white. If I had asked you for dinner, you would have laughed. If I had sent you flowers, you would have returned them. You respect strength. You respect competence. The only way to be in the room with you, the only way to hold your attention, was to be the one person you couldn't ignore. The confession hung in the air, raw and impossible. She was admitting that our entire professional history, the legendary rivalry that the industry whispered about, was a fabrication. It was a stage she had built just so we could play our parts. You started a war, I whispered, the realization settling over me like a heavy cloak. Just so you could meet me on the battlefield. I started a war because it was the only place I could see you fire back, she said. Her eyes were wet, shiny with unshed tears, but her gaze was unflinching. I wanted to see you angry. I wanted to see you brilliant. I wanted to be the reason you stayed up at night, even if it was because you hated me. Hate is a form of passion, isn't it? It's better than indifference. I couldn't bear your indifference. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out the rain. I wanted to be furious. I wanted to throw the book at her and storm out. But I couldn't. Because as I looked at her, stripped of her defenses, admitting to a madness that mirrored my own, I felt the last of my own armor disintegrate. I hadn't just been a victim of her obsession. I had been a willing participant. I had spent 10 years studying her, anticipating her moves, dressing for our meetings like I was dressing for a lover. I had told myself it was professional diligence. I had told myself I needed to know the enemy. But deep down, in the quiet places I never let myself visit, I knew. I knew why I wore the perfume she hated. I knew why I took every meeting she requested. I was just as addicted to the friction as she was. I didn't hate you, I admitted, the words falling from my lips before I could check them. Layla's breath hitched. She moved around the table. The barrier was gone. She stepped into my space, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her body, close enough to see the gold flecks in her irises. She didn't touch me. She didn't have to. The proximity was a physical weight, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I hated that I couldn't beat you, I continued, my voice dropping to a hush. I hated that you were the only person who made me feel challenged, alive. And now? She asked. Her voice was a ghost of a whisper. She tilted her head, exposing the elegant line of her throat, a terrifying offering of vulnerability. Now that you know I'm not a monster? Now that you know I'm just a woman who has been memorizing you for a decade? Now, I said, my eyes dropping to her lips. I think we're both dangerous. The air between us was electric, charged with 10 years of suppressed desire and professional violence. We stood inches apart, the ghost of every argument and every boardroom battle swirling around us. The urge to close the gap, to bridge the distance with touch, was overwhelming. It was a magnetic pull, inevitable and terrifying. Then, outside the glass walls, the world shifted. The relentless drumming of the rain slowed, tapering off into a soft patter. The gray sky began to fracture, revealing slivers of bruised blue light. The storm was breaking. The isolation that had trapped us here, that had forced this collision, was ending. Reality was coming back for us. The morning brought the helicopters. They descended like vultures, chopping the coastal air into rhythmic slices of noise that shattered the fragile reality we had inhabited. The legal teams returned with their pristine suits and dry shoes, bringing the world back with them in a rush of liability clauses and closing schedules. They flooded the estate, filling the void with the chatter of commerce. The library, our war room, our confessional, was reclaimed by paralegals who swept the mahogany table clear of our coffee cups and the ghost of our intimacy. Layla's notebook vanished into her briefcase, buried under layers of corporate strategy, disappearing as if it had never existed. We reverted. It was terrifying how easily the armor snapped back into place. Layla buttoned her blazer. I smoothed my hair. We sat on opposite sides of the long glass table in the main atrium, surrounded by 20 people who had no idea the ground beneath us had shifted. The air conditioning hummed, scrubbing the scent of rain and sandalwood from the room. When she spoke, her voice was the iron closer again. Cool, modulated, terrifyingly precise. Section 4, paragraph B is acceptable, she said, not looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on the paperwork, her face a mask of indifference. We can proceed to signatures. I signed my name. The ink was black and permanent. The merger was historic, but as I watched her sign next to me, the triumph tasted like ash. We were architects of a deal that would make us both richer and more powerful, yet we were dismantling the only thing that had ever felt real. The friction was gone, replaced by a hollow consensus. The retreat happened in stages. Handshakes, hollow congratulations, the packing of equipment. I found myself standing in the corridor near the front entrance, watching the staff load the black SUVs. I was waiting for her to leave, or maybe I was waiting for her to stay. I didn't know which outcome terrified me more. Arya. Her voice was soft, pitched below the noise of the foyer. I turned. Layla stood near the coat check, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked impeccable, untouchable, except for her eyes. They were pleading. The board seat, she said quietly, stepping closer so the junior partners wouldn't hear. The terms of the merger give me a seat on your board. I can decline it. I can cite a conflict of interest. I can make sure you never have to see me across a table again. It was an offering. She was willing to exile herself to protect me from the discomfort of our history. Or perhaps to protect herself from the pain of being near me without being with me. It was the bravest thing she had ever done in a negotiation. It was a concession of the heart, and I panicked. The fear was a cold, sharp thing in my gut. If she stayed, if she took the seat, the game would continue, but the rules would be broken. If she left, I would be safe. I would be lonely, but I would be safe. Don't be ridiculous, I said, my voice sounding brittle and foreign. It's a strategic asset. You earn the seat. Keep it professional, Layla. We have a company to run. She flinched. It was microscopic, a tightening of the jaw, a slight widening of the eyes, but I saw it. I had rejected the woman and accepted the asset. I had chosen the ledger over the truth. Professional, she repeated, the word tasting bitter. Of course. Unflinching efficiency. She nodded once, a sharp, finalizing gesture. Then she turned and walked out the door. I watched through the glass as she slid into the back of the waiting sedan. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't look back at me. The door slammed shut, a heavy, decisive thud that echoed in my chest long after the car had disappeared down the winding coast road. The deal closed at 4 p.m. The stock market reacted with jubilation. My phone exploded with messages of congratulations. I stood in the empty atrium of the Blackwood estate, staring at the ocean. The storm was gone, leaving the water flat and gray. I had won. I had beaten the iron closer. I had secured the legacy of my firm. But as I walked back to my own car, leaving the glass fortress behind, I felt a profound, hollow ache. I had survived the storm, but I had left the only part of me that mattered back in the library. I returned to the city. The skyline was the same, the office was the same, but the silence in my penthouse was deafening, echoing the specific, terrible quiet of a life perfectly arranged, yet completely empty. 3 months is an eternity in finance, but it is a heartbeat in grief. The merger was hailed as a masterpiece of modern restructuring. My face graced the covers of industry magazines, captured in high-contrast black and white, looking severe, competent, and victorious. The stock price climbed 18% in the first quarter. By every metric I had spent my life worshiping, I had won. I was the queen of the hill. But the view from the summit was desolate. Victory, I discovered, was a cold, sterile room with perfect air conditioning and a silence that rang in my ears like tinnitus. I saw Layla exactly 4 times in those 90 days. The first was the quarterly board meeting. She sat at the far end of the mahogany table, a distant, polished statue carved from marble. She didn't click her pen. She didn't look at me with that dark, hungry intensity that used to make my skin prickle. She looked through me. She was professional. She was exactly what I had asked her to be, and it was excruciating. It was like watching a fire burn out, leaving only gray, suffocating ash where the heat used to be. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to throw a file. I wanted to provoke the monster just to see if she was still in there. The second and third times were charity galas, black tie affairs where we circled the same ballroom like binary stars pushed out of orbit. I watched her from the safety of a champagne flute's rim. She was charming, laughing with a hedge fund manager, touching his arm lightly with a practiced grace. It was a performance. I knew it was a performance because I knew the script now. I knew that when she really laughed, her eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that ruined her composure. I knew she hated champagne. I knew she was bored, just like I was. But the distance between us was absolute, a wall of silence we had both built, brick by professional brick. I found myself haunting my own memories, revisiting the pages of the notebook I hadn't let myself steal. I missed the war. I missed the friction. I missed the way my heart rate spiked when she entered a room. I missed the person who wrote down the way I held my coffee cup. Safety, I realized, was a prison of predictability. I had traded the most terrifying electric connection of my life for a stable portfolio. The breaking point arrived in the quiet of a senior partner's office. Elena, my mentor for 15 years, poured me a scotch and looked at me with unmasked pity. "You look like you're in mourning," she said. "The integration is flawless," I deflected. "You're miserable because you let her walk away," she countered. I froze. "We were rivals," Elena laughed, a dry sound. "Arya, you were a two-person opera. Everyone saw it. That wasn't hatred across the boardroom. That was devotion disguised as competition. Now you've won, and you're realizing the only prize worth having was the one you fought against." Her words stripped away the last of my denial. Devotion disguised as competition. I had spent 10 years trying to beat her because it was the only way to be close to her. I went back to my office and pulled up the itinerary. The Iron Closer was scheduled to speak on global strategy. Zurich. Tomorrow. The risk was astronomical. Ruin was possible. But looking at the empty efficiency of my life, I realized ruin was preferable to this numbness. I booked the ticket. I didn't pack a suit. I didn't pack a strategy. I packed a question that had been burning a hole in my chest for 3 months. Zurich was a city of clockwork and ice, a fitting backdrop for the woman who had built her life on absolute precision. I found her in the hotel bar after her keynote address. The room was a cavern of dark wood and low light, populated by the quiet, serious murmurs of deals being struck over 20-year-old scotch. She was sitting alone in a high-backed leather booth near the window, staring out at the snow falling silently on the Limmat River. She wore velvet tonight, a deep midnight blue that made her skin look porcelain pale in the dim light. She looked regal. She looked untouchable. She looked like the loneliest person in the world. I didn't hesitate this time. I walked across the room, the sound of my heels absorbed by the plush carpet. I stopped at her table. She sensed me before she saw me. Her spine stiffened, that familiar reflex of defense, before she turned. When her eyes met mine, the heavy crystal glass in her hand trembled just enough to create a ripple in the amber liquid. "You're off your territory," she said. Her voice was steady, practiced, but I heard the strain beneath it, the fatigue of maintaining the facade. "The restructuring panel isn't until Thursday." "I'm not here for the panel," I said, sliding into the booth opposite her. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait for an invite. "I'm here to renegotiate." Layla set her glass down with a deliberate click. "The deal is closed, Arya. The terms are final. You made that very clear in the hallway. Not those terms." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, invading the sanctuary of her isolation. "I want to reopen the discussion on the board seat, on the conflict of interest, on the lie I told you 3 months ago when I said I wanted safety." She stared at me, her expression warring between hope and deep, ingrained skepticism. "You said you wanted professional. You said we had a company to run. You chose the ledger." I was wrong. The admission felt like a physical release, a weight dropping from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. "I don't want professional. I want the person who wrote in the margins of her notebook. I want the friction. I want the mess. I tried the silence, Layla. It's deafening. The silence that stretched between us now was loud, filled with the noise of everything we hadn't said for 10 years. Layla looked away, watching the snow fall against the glass. I almost resigned yesterday, she said quietly, the confession hanging in the air like smoke. I drafted the letter. I was going to leave the industry. I thought if I removed myself from the equation, the ache would finally stop. Don't, I said, reaching across the table. This time, I didn't pull back. I covered her hand with mine. Her skin was warm, her pulse jumping frantically against my palm. Don't you dare quit. We don't retreat, Layla. We acquire. She looked back at me, and the iron closer was gone. Her eyes were wide, dark, and completely unguarded. What are you proposing? A partnership, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. No more rivalry, no more armor. We play the game, but we play it on the same side. And when the doors close, we stop playing entirely. Complete transparency, no hidden agendas. That's a high-risk strategy, she murmured, turning her hand over to interlace her fingers with mine. The grip was tight, desperate. I'm diversifying my portfolio, I smiled, a genuine, terrified smile. Come upstairs. Her suite was quiet, a neutral space of beige and cream that smelled faintly of her sandalwood perfume. We didn't turn on the lights. We stood by the window, the city lights of Zurich glittering below us like scattered diamonds. The negotiation continued, but the currency had changed. We traded honesties instead of assets. I was jealous of everyone who got to speak to you, she admitted, her voice rough with emotion. Every time you smiled at a client, I wanted to burn the building down. I wore the perfume you hated because I knew you'd notice it, I countered, stepping closer. I wanted to be the only thing you could smell. She stepped closer. The space between us vanished. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw, a touch so reverent and gentle it made my knees weak. She rested her forehead against mine. We breathed the same air, a shared rhythm of relief and terrifying proximity. It wasn't about sex. It was about the collapse of the walls we had spent a lifetime building. It was the intimacy of being finally, truly known. This is going to be complicated, she whispered against my skin. Good, I breathed back, closing my eyes. I hate simple. The morning light over the Alps was blindingly bright, a clean slate washing over the city. We drank coffee in silence, watching the sun hit the snow. It wasn't the silence of secrets anymore. It was the silence of peace. We had a board meeting in London in 2 days. We had a merger to manage. But for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't preparing for war. I was preparing to build something that would last. 3 months later, the heavy oak doors to the boardroom opened. We walked in together, shoulder to shoulder, a united front of tailored wool and absolute competence. The room went quiet as we approached the head of the table. I caught Layla's eye as we took our seats. She tapped her pen once against the mahogany, a signal only I understood, a secret language in a room full of noise. We weren't just partners. We were co-conspirators in a life we had stolen back from the ledger. The riskiest investment of my career had yielded the only return that mattered. If you understand the danger of mixing business with desire, subscribe for more stories from The Edge.